My name is Joe. I'm a member of the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment. And I just wanted to comment and then follow up by a question. My comment is that your discussion today has been primarily focused on economics, probably more so than environmental issues and policy issues. And I think that's telling, because I think it tells us that this artificial creation that we've done as humans in economics is actually incredibly powerful, and it's actually overturning some of the policy and environmental concerns. You know, a lot of what you're talking about with photovoltaics and wind is all based on economic arguments, and not so much on the environmental or policy. So to continue and this is leading into my question, I think you can make an analogy of climate change issues with the stock market. We're driven by fear and greed. Over the last 30 years, climate change policy has been, or the climate change concerns have been aware, yet fear hasn't taken over yet. It's, up until this point, still been driven by greed. And now we have Hurricane Sandy, Australians' angry summer, the Midwest drought in the United States, now the Western drought in the United States, and we had a little event here in June you may have heard about, which all seem to be arguing that to people that fear should be coming to replace some of those greed issues. Yet we're still not quite there. What is limiting us from, and I think once we hit that fear, and this is where the stock market analogy comes in, once we hit that fear level, then everything changes. But we haven't hit it there yet. And I'm wondering what's stopping us. Is it human nature? Is it media? Is it greed's a bit more powerful than fear? Just looking for an opinion.
Wow, I don't know, Bob. What do you? That's a really good one.
I'm very interested in this analogy to fear and greed in connection with it, and the way in which extreme weather is now beginning to challenge some of those assumptions. And I just would make one comment, and that is I think we're going to see a fallout in the insurance rates in southern Alberta over the next 2 or 3 years that is going to raise the economic context of some of that fear in connection with extreme weather. And I'm going to be interested in just tracking that one. Some of my friends in Switzerland and elsewhere in the insurance business are going to be churning out some of the most powerful arguments with regard to extreme weather that I've seen yet. They have financial motives for wanting to do it, but some of their work is pretty systematic in terms of the way they've done it.
Yeah, and look, just returning to that question you asked of why the fear hasn't taken over, I think it's part of that is due to the fact that people don't recognise what they're seeing.
Yeah.
So they think, oh, it's a flood. Well, maybe it's it's just a big flood. We've had them in the past. Maybe we'll get them again, and nothing much to it. You have to see the systematic picture of change, and at the Climate Commission, we really tried to drive that message home. So with our Angry Summer report, we said, here are the 123 weather records that were broken this summer. And when you're breaking records, you're moving into a new climate. These are conditions we've never seen before in the country, right? So you sort of make an argument that links all of these changes in a way that shows the influence of a changing climate system on them, whether they be floods, bushfire risk, heat waves, or whatever else. And I think it's really important that people understand that link. Otherwise, the temptation is just to say, oh, it's just weather,
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so James Glaive, I'm with Tides Canada. I just wanted to convey a couple of questions that we've had over Twitter and invite any others in the room who may be a bit shy at the mic to just tweet to the hashtag low carbon to chime in. First of the two questions is, where are the greatest gains to be had with technology innovation in terms of the low carbon transition? Would they be on the energy production side or distribution or consumption? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, look, to me, the greatest gains, I think, have happened with this, with the deeper penetration of wind and solar into stationary energy markets, because just even at relatively low levels of penetration, they've been very disruptive of the market.
Yeah.
And it's free. the energy that's not required is free energy. It's used for other things. I don't know how you see that, but.
Well, I see to a certain extent both. I see that these issues of technology are sort of interconnected. You know, our renewables are dependent upon our transmission capability because in so many instances the location of the renewable is away from the market conditions. So I see distribution as well as just the basic technology being part of it. I also think that there is, on the renewables area, there is a very interesting series of public reactions now beginning to emerge in jurisdictions like Ontario, where they tried to go almost overboard in promoting renewables by offering prices that were, and they're now getting a consumer backlash in connection with it. So part of what we're dealing with right now as we move to these new technologies is to be finding the right balance rate at which the incentive is there so it becomes a permanent feature, not like all the windmills in California that died in the 1970s. And in Ontario, we're into a situation where the consumers and local populations are reacting in a way which is counterproductive. And it's finding that balance so you're not driving consumers away, who in the end result are the voters and others that are critical for public policy.
Okay.
Do you have other?
Yeah, there's one other question I wanted to get to.
Sure, please go ahead.
I wanted to first credit that last one to Binu YYC, who asked that question. The next one is from Marlo Reynolds, who's challenging Tim. And he asks, how does Tim best convey, say in 30 seconds or less, the extent and quality of scientific research done on climate change?
In 30 seconds or less?
Yes.
My God.
Well, 60 volumes, IPCC.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, God.
40 characters.
Well,
thank you.
And jet lagged. Okay, no. Well, look, I think, James, what I'd say to that tweet is that, you know, that when you look at the IPCC reports, they include all of the peer-reviewed scientific literature, they assess it, and then they look at the probabilities or the risk of outcomes that come out of that. So they're broadly representative of the scientific base, and they give us a general sense of what the most likely outcomes are. And, you know, until we get a better system of dealing with it than the IPCC, then we're going to, you know, use the IPCC. And I haven't heard anyone suggest an improvement on IPCC as a better system that we might have.
Go ahead, please.
Thanks to both of you.
By the way, we're in very sharp lights here, so I can't recognize anyone as quickly as I should. My apologies.
No worries. Leo Rothschild is my name. Thank you so much to both of you for a really interesting talk tonight. I'm glad that you touched a lot on renewables, especially the interesting discussion on when renewables become competitive at a high price for fossil fuel energy. What I'm really interested in is what I see sort of disappearing, which I think is a good thing, this sort of kind of like a division between the renewables industry and fossil fuel industry, where there's, I think, incredible opportunity for them to actually work together. Obviously, you know, taking the oil sands as an example, there's a need for input energy to extract bitumen, and why couldn't renewables be that input energy? I've been following a number of examples who are trying to do that, especially trying to convert fugitive emissions or fugitive gases as an input product. But a lot of those examples have either disappeared or perhaps couldn't compete with low gas prices. I'm interested to know if you see some examples that maybe I'm not aware of. I'd love to hear from them, especially if Australia has some interesting examples to share, and what you might think is the real future potential of those two industries working together.
Sure, yeah. I think there's going to be cooperation and competition at the same time through the whole thing. But to give you just some examples from Australia, one early stage development at the moment involves the capture of carbon dioxide from our natural gas wells, which they have a lot of CO2 in them because it's old gas. Capturing that and using renewable energy to make it into methane, and that's done by, you can use solar, which is, we've got a great resource in Australia. You take off the CO2, and then you use the electricity to hydrolyse water, so you've got free hydrogen, and then you can react the free hydrogen with the CO2 to make natural gas that you feed back into the pipe. And about a 70% efficiency for that sort of process. It's already operational in Europe at scale using overnight wind. So that's one example where using that CO2 is important. But I just make a broader point that, the world around us was made out of thin air. It was made out of thin air using photosynthesis, drawing CO2 from the atmosphere. So the world we see and products like that are all made out of thin air. And that's the future, I think, in some ways for in terms of our technological evolution. It is some people call it the third way, of using the excess CO2 to make a future for ourselves. But very early days technologically.
Please go ahead.
My name is Ken Yasenchuk. Thanks, Tim, for writing a book that really raised my consciousness on this issue, and I'm sure your other stuff is good too.
Thank you.
I'll have to get to that as well. I'll try to be brief. I was struck by your discussion of renewables, and you mentioned solar and wind. But a few years ago, there was an MIT study on the prospects for geothermal energy.
Yes.
That was actually, you're probably aware of it. I'm not very good with statistics, but they in the abstract, there was a very striking statistic that stated that the inventory, the potential inventory of energy available from enhanced geothermal sources was approximately 4,000 times the annual consumption of energy in the United States.
Yeah.
Something like that. I don't know if I'm stating it correctly, but at any rate, I was wondering what if you had an opinion on the prospects for geothermal, and also in terms of transitioning areas where, like Alberta and many other areas of the world where a lot of industrial activity is really tied to oil and gas. Oil and gas involves digging holes to find energy. Geothermal involves digging holes to find energy.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's a case to be made for, at least in the long term, transitioning and leveraging some of the skills that we have in our energy industry and redeploying them toward geothermal.
Sure. Look, I must say my thoughts some years ago very closely paralleled yours. I thought that there was a case in Australia for investing in geothermal. In fact, I invested some of my superannuation funds in the geothermal company, and perhaps I'll be rewarded in heaven for that, but I'm not going to see anything, I don't think, on the stock market in recent times. And what's actually happened, you're quite right, we're surrounded by energy, of all different sorts, under the ground, in the wind, in the sunlight, wherever. But geothermal just hasn't developed to scale in the way that solar and wind have. The big difference with solar and wind is that we've been able to commercialise them at such a large scale, we've been able to drive down prices steeply, and that driving down continues. And electricity is a generic product. I mean, there's head-to-head competition in the market for it, yeah? So it's whoever can develop it cheapest, and deliver it cheapest into the market is usually, by and large, the winner. So I think geothermal it's probably going to be important in certain niches, and I know that in some parts of the world, like the Philippines and around the Rim of Fire, around the Pacific, there's some valuable resources that are being used, and there are other examples of that, but it just hasn't yet got to scale in the way that wind and solar have, and so my thinking's changed, I guess, recently, and I now think that really the renewables, the wind and solar, have the biggest potential to make a difference simply because of that cost impact.
By the way, in response to the MIT study, the government of Alberta got Michael Moore at the policy school here and several others to work on a report on the Alberta potential for geothermal. And the only other thing I'd mention is TransAlta are, of course, partnering with Warren Buffett in California on some quite large. This gets down to the scale. Some of theirs are up at 200 megawatts now of the individual units. So it's, but California is so different than Alberta. I'm not trying to say that we've got immediate prospects for that kind of scale, but certainly there's been some work done. Certainly the potential, from what I have read, is there. And the thing to remember is that geothermal fits conveniently with thermal boilers, so that there is some compatibility with some of the existing systems, as I understand it. I'm not an expert on this field, but your question's a very good one, and there's certainly some work being done in Alberta on that. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Matt Ishoy, and I just made a few notes here so I don't ramble on too much. So there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about economics and the economics of alternatives versus non-alternatives, and my concern with that is economics really does reward short-term thinking for the most part, but the environment and ecology really requires long-term insight and foresight into the future. And when we rely on economics, we have things like in North Dakota right now, where they flared, I think, roughly about $1 billion worth of natural gas because it wasn't economically viable to hook up to systems where we could use it, so there was a surplus, so we just flared it. I work in oil and gas, and I have a number of projects that go on, and because it's a better economic situation to flare instead of filling the pipeline with N2 first and then flaring an inert gas, we make decisions like that. With markets, as we drop our demand for oil and gas and fossil fuels, the price is going to drop. We saw that back in the 70s, and then all those alternative energies that were coming up then got taken out. They became unprofitable, and they disappeared. And a lot of that technology we're reusing now, but we're likely to see the same situation. Also, with petrochemicals, or with oil and gas, we're talking about petrochemicals where we now use it for fertilizers. Everything we do, plastics, pretty much everything we do involves this, and I think it's easy to look at carbon and carbon offsets and all these types of programs, but at what point does it become a human issue, and at what point does it become a caring issue, and how do we develop our capacity for caring so that we're not making decisions based on just the economic output, but what's best for the species? And at what point do people wake up and realize that economics is a subset of the ecology, not vice versa? We talk a lot about economics and ecology in the same breath, or the environment and economics, but we're under the laws of ecology and the environment, and I don't know, do you see anywhere or any sign that economics can fix this? Or at some point, do people need to step in and say that this isn't an economic issue, this is a human issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question. I think that's so important. It is one of the elements that's been missing from our discussion tonight.
Yes, it has.
Thought about raising it a couple of times and haven't quite got around to doing it. But the economic system, it's enormously powerful, right? It can deliver outcomes, but it needs to be, in my view, controlled and regulated. And that's the role of government, is to regulate for things. So when you were talking about gas flaring, you can have a regulation that says you can't flare gas. You've got to use it. That's what there are agreements now around the world to move in that direction. So we need a regulatory framework that we as a society think reflects the right things to do for us, that constrains the raw power of the economic system to deliver change.
You hear the problem in Alberta is a lot of times people have been in oil and gas for 30, 40 years. These are the people I deal with all the time. And they truly, they're not bad, immoral people.
Yeah, sure.
They're just doing something that in today's environment isn't necessarily helpful. So how do you protect those people and not say to them that, no, what you're doing, it's not oil and gas that's a problem. It's actually an amazing progress that we can, burn fuels and get them to do things that we weren't able to. But how do we get people to realize that we can't just exploit it to the point where we never use it anymore?
Yeah.
Well, that's the immediate challenge we face.
And we tried to get at some of that, and I quite agree it was inadequate when we tried to talk about the science, the communication of science today, which I don't think is very adequate. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Claire Beckstead. I've spent a lot of time working with municipal governments on energy and climate change issues. And recently, especially given the flooding in Calgary and Hurricane Sandy, one thing I've noticed is that sort of the political attention and the political resources are being redirected towards things like adaptation strategies for future events. And even if there's an acknowledgement that, yes, this is climate change and it's due to climate change that we're seeing these bigger storms and drought events and these sorts of things, the political will is to deal with how do we survive the next one better rather than focusing on mitigation, which I still think is absolutely critical. So I'm just curious to hear sort of maybe your advice on how do we make sure that when we skip over to adaptation, how do we not forget about mitigation as an important piece of the puzzle?
It's absolutely essential that we don't skip over mitigation. I mean, that's a bit of a sleight of hand trick, to say, oh, we're just going to adapt. The trouble is, if you keep on polluting, you shift the goalposts. Conditions get more and more severe. So whatever adaptation you do today is going to be inadequate tomorrow. So it's very, very clear that we need to do both of those things. I think we just need to remind our politicians and businesses that yes, we've got to adapt to the unavoidable, but avoid the unadaptable. Avoid things we can't adapt to.
One of the areas where your question is so pressing and so urgent today for both First Nations and for whites is in the north. Mackenzie Valley, where we're seeing such enormous changes in winter temperatures, 7 or 8 degrees Celsius, and the way in which that impacts the permafrost and the ice shield on the Arctic Ocean. And one of the great difficulties I have is not with your position of making sure we're going forward with both at the same time, but there has been an enormous absence and negligence in looking at some of the areas of Canada and the adaptation that was essential, which must go with mitigation as well. And the difficulty we have here is that there has been an internal debate. Should it be mitigation? Should it be adaptation? When in fact, like sustainable development, they should be brought together, because the adaptation then helps to drive us to do more on mitigation. Please go ahead.
Hey Bob, David Lertzman from University of Calgary, and I would like to thank you, Dr. Flannery, for your inspiration and your contributions to this planet. You've certainly inspired me, and I've read your book and listened to it on tape, The Weather Makers. So it's an honor to get to meet you. And I'd like to address a comment at the big picture and then get a response. Drawing on the two big themes for me would be the biophysical and the cultural. And I've come to sort of think of the two options as the great crash or the great turning, to use Joanna Macy's term. We as a species seem to have a competitive advantage which relates to the cultural scale, that we can actually choose to evolve culturally. We could be a turn-on-the-dime species from an evolutionary point of view. And something that really sticks in my craw, I guess, if I'm over 50, I can be crotchety now. Something that sticks, I've been waiting for that actually. Something that sticks in my craw is this idea that, well, it's all those people on those countries on the other side of the world breeding like flies. Actually, if we look at really the appropriated carrying capacity on this planet, the the lion's share is by the wealthy countries. So we're all the haves here arguing about how we can hold on to what little we have and deny the rest of the world. That's how it seems to me.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at it from an ecological footprint point of view, as one species, we're appropriating about 50% of the global products of photosynthesis. And that one species, 20% is using 80% of what we take. And you articulated it quite clearly that when we share the wealth and when we, in particular with women, give autonomy, things change, populations stabilize. So from a big scale, we've got this threshold that we seem to have probably crossed in the mid or late 80s around what the planet produces in terms of photosynthesis and the productive output of the planet and what we use of that. So we've already crossed a threshold where we're using more than what the planet can produce. And some have talked about, you know, like the Titanic. We may already be hitting the iceberg, but because we're these two-legged creatures that walk around, we're not thinking in 80-year timescales, at least not the culture that you know, is running the marketplace. And so we may already be hitting the wall and not realizing it. And my question, after one more comment, is going to go to that around the parts per million, because it seems to me that, yes, technology is important, and we got to do everything that we can. I work at a university. I'm very in favor of critical, rational discourse. But I don't think we're gonna think our way into sustainability. It's gonna take more than that.
Yeah.
And it must be a cross-cultural proposition or we're sunk.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at how do we hedge our bets as a species from the great crash and the great turning, or we're already in the great crash and we don't know it because I'm not a climate scientist.
No.
So.
Wow, they're really big thoughts. I mean, that's the future of our planet, the future of our species. And I have to answer it with a story, really, rather than any facts, if I can. It's what gives me hope, you know, is I look around at my fellow human beings, I look at myself, I know that we are greedy and selfish individuals, right? That's what we are. We're, you know, we want everything and we want it now and you know, blow the damn the consequences. And I look around and say, well, where else do you see that in nature, right? Where else do we see anything like that? And there is one example where we see that. It's that little organ sitting on top of our brainstem there in our skull. You know, the human brain weighs 2% of our body weight, but it uses 20% of the energy that we consume, right? So it is greedy by any definition. It's using 10 times as much as any other organ, right? That area. It's incredibly selfish. You stress the body and watch what happens. The brain will deprive every other organ of everything before it deprives itself of one iota of oxygen, you know, or anything else, right? But the brain has one rule that allows it to live with the body, right? It knows it can never bankrupt the system that feeds it. So it's greedy and selfish, absolutely, but it can't bankrupt the body. In a way, our species is becoming the intelligence of the planet. We are the way the planet knows itself in that sense. And I think that despite that selfishness and greediness, that we have it within us to live sustainably. I can't chart you a pathway for it, but I can see that it is possible for greedy, selfish entities to live with their life support system in a way that doesn't bankrupt it.
And we're right on time.
We're right on time, okay.
So
So
can
don't
we
say
move
anything-
to some of the other questions?
Don't say anything else? Okay.
I think I'll give the other people a chance
Okay,
to
thank you.
ask their questions. Thank you.
Sorry.
Hey, I'm still Brad. I'm a geek. I put a company locally here in Calgary. We put $5 million together and we raised $880 billion in market capitalization. Being a geek and a technologist, I have a tendency to see technologies and trends in the future before they happen. The last comment was, did we hit an iceberg or have we hit an iceberg? The question is moot. We have hit the iceberg. Currently, we are losing 65% of the human diversity on the planet right now due to global dimming, the amount of atmosphere that's actually changing the amount of vitamin D being produced in the skin of people. So we have lost genetic diversity of the human species. It's going to continue. We have an 85% cancer rate due to that loss. As a geek and a technology guy, how do we bring the innovative capital that we need to bring the changes across? And if we can't, will places like China begin massive change in an attempt to save their race?
Yeah, well, wow. Just briefly, really, because I know we're running out of time with that. China are great manufacturers. They're not yet great innovators. You know, if you're looking for innovation, it's California or Europe. You know, so where we're in immature technologies, that's where we see the big things. But when it comes to just cookie cutter, getting it out, mass production at cost, I think China's winning. But
So how do we bring capital to Alberta?
yeah, well.
Anyway, one more question, and then I'm going to have to cut it off because I am otherwise going to be guillotined by the...
It's Craig Dunn with Borealis Geopower. Glad somebody else asked the geothermal question, so I don't have to be that guy. I just had a question about messaging. Both you're involved in the communication sides and the science community. We hear a lot of talk about intelligent, rational dialogue and how it seems restricted. Coming from some marketing background, we know that you make a decision emotionally and then you justify it rationally. How do we and this is a question that hopefully everyone can take out of this, how do we as the science community better communicate complex situations to a general audience?
Wow. Well, I mean, that's what we've been trying to do for the last few years, and I've found some of the great enemies of getting...
If you could tell us a success story. So
Yeah. This is sort of like that. But the reason we often don't get through are people are scared or they're not listening, you know. And you need a calm, quiet space where people feel valued, where they feel their contribution is valued, a forum like this, in order to start getting cut through. I think you're absolutely right that the emotional stuff is incredibly important. And when we get to the intellectual stuff, it's often just a rationalisation for an emotional decision, but it does have some impact. So you're trying to just operate at the margins there to open things up a little bit and allow people at least to process some information. So that's the reason that we've set up the Climate Commission as it is. It's apolitical, because the second you touch on politics, temperatures go up. You know, you get away from rational stuff. So we won't, no matter how tempting it is, we won't trash any politicians or any policies or anything like that. We simply stick to the facts. We're a very broad church. We try to have all sides of things represented there and just get out and meet people face to face, because we find, again, meeting people face to face, you get so much better cut through than you do just doing media appearances and whatever else. You've got to do it all, but it's a slow, hard grind when you do it that way, you know, but it's the only way we know how to do it.
Just in closing, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight, for your excellent questions, and I would also like to ask you at this time to join with me in thanking our speaker for all his interesting comments.
Both of these two gentlemen and pass on a little gift to thank you. That was an excellent, amazing conversation, and it was great to have you host it. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And thanks, Tim.
Thank
that was
you.
just wonderful.
Right.
Wonderful to hear your story. Okay, well, I just wanted to wrap up here. I think it's been a really tremendous conversation. A couple of highlights I felt were it was really great to hear those stories, the story of change from Australia, from Europe, from China, the numbers, you know, the volume of change that we don't really hear those stories as much as we should here in Canada to know what's happening. So thank you very much for that. That was a real highlight. I also found it interesting to hear the story of the collapse of the coal industry. And I was thinking, oh my God, we sold this to the University of Calgary and Bob and the University of Alberta, that Australia's economy was very similar to Canada's, had fossil fuel, natural resource extraction. And really, we were saying on the flight down from Edmonton, you know, this is the first that all of us had heard that the coal industry had really collapsed and how fast that had happened. So I think that's just something for us to take note of, and how fast this change can happen. I also thought it was fascinating to hear what the Australian Climate Commission has done to get the public story out. I think there might be something for us in Canada to think about having a body whose job is to translate the science, to translate the weather, to translate the international negotiations to the public. Really an inspiring story. And lastly, I just wanted to say the rugby analogy, and the inspiration you take to get across the line, that is going to stay with me for a while.